Good morning, everyone. I'm here to talk about drivers on alternative fuels. What do I mean by that? We have a little melting pot here on the bottom left of all the different alternative fuels that we're looking at. LNG, ammonia, methanol, biofuels, and a whole host of others, which unfortunately I won't have enough time to cover today. What really is the salt and pepper that goes into driving all these alternative fuels? I've selected 4 key factors that you can see on the top left. If you look at the table on the right, I've listed them specifically and I will elaborate a bit more. The first 2 factors relate to pricing, which will be the focus of my presentation today. So let's start off with point number 1, green premiums. As alluded by many panelists yesterday, sectors which are closer to the end consumer, i.e. containers, car carriers, we are already seeing the end users there willing to pay a bit more to move their goods on a lower carbon voyage. 2 key data points on that. One is ZEMBA, the Zero Emission Maritime Buyers Alliance, which Hapag-Lloyd won in April. You've got the likes of Nike, IKEA, Amazon, willing to pay more for lower carbon voyages. Another fun fact for you is that to move a pair of shoes from east to west on a container ship, it will cost less than $1 to do so on a fully green voyage. Unfortunately for tankers and bulkers, last year when I was here, I was moderating a panel with a very prominent dry bulk owner. The calculations are not as good. To entice his end user to be fully green, he needs to double or triple his freight. And if you're a steel mill in China, that completely kills your economics. That leads me to point number 2. So if you're in the tanker and bulker sector, how can you actually decarbonize? And then we come down to regulation. So for regulation, there's a whole host of abbreviations, but to simplify it, I like to look at it as, is it a carrot or is it a stick? So we'll start off with the global sort of regulation, IMO. We've got CII and EEXI. To me, that's obviously a stick. If an old fuel inefficient vessel is unable to decarbonize, it's no longer EEXI compliant. If it's got an E rating, it has 2 years to get back to a C rating, so that's definitely a stick. For localized regulations, EU ETS, fuel, EU maritime, it could be a carrot, it could be a stick. If you're a young, modern, dual-fuel LNG vessel, that's a carrot. You're going to make more than your competitor. If you're an old fuel-inefficient vessel, that's going to be a stick. And I would like to point out that obviously EU is a localized regulation, so avoidance is a plausible strategy. And moving on to the bigger picture again for IMO, MEPC 82 occurs in London next week. There's going to be a global carbon tax debated, so we'll wait with bated breath to see what the results are. Points 3 and 4 relate more to the availability and the physical aspect of the fuel, which is equally important. For technology, typically we look at alternative fuels measured using TRL, technological readiness level, on a scale of 1 to 9. Right now, ammonia as it stands, while you may see it in the order book, it's still struggling to get certification because obviously if there's an ammonia leak, it could be fatal to crew members. And on the last point here on availability and infrastructure, I think Caroline from SSA and Hong Lam mentioned it really nicely. Singapore, massive bunkering, biggest bunkering port in the world. We've only got 3 LNG tankers. If we want to have the ability to send ammonia and methanol, you're going to need end-to-end supply chains, availability, scalability, and infrastructure. So for the focus of my presentation today, I want to put on a pricing lens because, many ship owners in the room, and I think that's what the key focus is on. And unfortunately, I only have enough time to cover LNG, ammonia, and methanol. So let's start with the easy one first, LNG. It's easy because it's been more than 10 years since the first dual-fuel vessel came about. There's very transparent pricing already. So the charts here, I want you to focus on the light blue line, which is the price of LNG. And if you imagine the world map, we've got Americas on the left, Asia on the right, Europe in the center. I will split my analysis into 3 parts, the past, the present, the future. So for the past, if I can direct your attention to 2022, we see the huge spike in the light blue lines for LNG. Obviously, this relates to the Ukraine conflict, spike in LNG prices. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a dual-fuel LNG ship in 2022 if it had the option to burn both, to burn LNG. It would probably be burning VLSFO. For the present, if you look at 2024, like the light blue line has now intersected the green line, which is the price of VLSFO, which is cool news. You can not only save the environment and decarbonize, but you're actually doing so at a cheaper price. And for the future, if you look to the curves from 2025 onwards, you would actually see that VLSFO is expected to become more economical than LNG is expected to become more economical than VLSFO, as evident in the light blue line below the green line. Obviously, the US, massive producer of US LNG, a lot of LNG capacity coming up. So you can see the pricing economics is even more severe and intense as per the light blue line on the left chart. So now that we've covered LNG, I'm going to move on into the other more difficult sectors, ammonia and methanol. Unfortunately, there's no historical price trend of ammonia and methanol. I can't just pluck it out from any database. So instead of looking at what is the price being offered because of availability, I try and figure out what is the break-even price that ammonia and methanol needs to be so that it can penetrate and entice ship owners to switch. So I'm trying to solve for the green bar on the far right, the ammonia and methanol break-even price. I start off with the left side, fossil fuel price, the price of VLSFO. So step one, I need to get the red bar to the blue bar. I convert VLSFO into its dollar per MMBTU, its energy equivalent. As you know, 1 ton of LNG is equivalent to 120% of VLSFO, so we need to switch the energy value using LHV, lower heat value. Then we add on step 2, which is the blue bars, your ETS cost, your fuel EU Maritime, to effectively get your light blue bar, and step 3 is to reconvert it back. So what does this tell us? There's a lot going on here, but I want you to focus on the left chart and the left bar on VLSFO in 2030. The left-hand side axis is the price that ammonia needs to be. The right-hand side is methanol. So the 3 fuel EU ETS, fuel EU Maritime and EU ETS bars has been converted here. And I want you to focus on the sheer height of the bar. So as you can see, your first key takeaway, number 1, is that in 2030, your ammonia and methanol needs to be about $400 per ton to oust VLSFO. If you switch to the chart on the right, VLSFO in 2030, you would see that the number is $550 per ton. The difference between the left and the right-hand chart is that the left-hand side pertains to extra EU, i.e. one port outside of EU, one port inside of EU. As we know, there's 50% sort of calculations there. On the right-hand side is intra-EU, so it's 100%, so there's more penalties there. I want you to remember this 400 to 550 number. The other key takeaway from this slide is if you look to 2050 on the far-hand right-hand side, you would see that VLSFO, the approximate price you would need is about $1,400 per ton. So what that means is that through credible sources, we know that the leading liner operators today, they are paying about $1,100 per ton for green methanol, and that is significantly higher than the break-even rates that you will see in 2030 to 2040. So that begs the question, why are people still ordering methanol tankers today? I've actually oversimplified things. I think there's 2 reasons for that. One, as I alluded to in the start of the presentation, you have, if you're in the container sector, you have end users willing to pay more for lower carbon solutions. And the other one is that obviously for fuel EU Maritime, there is a pooling concept. If you own 1 methanol vessel, you can offset the payment of fines on 10 VLSFO vessels. A lot of these large liner operators, they have fleets of 400 to 500, so the presence of just a few methanol vessels can really help offset the potential payment in fines. The last thing I want to point out on this slide is on LNG. As you can see, LNG, in 2030, you don't have any fuel EU Maritime penalties. So LNG is not only economically viable, but it looks really good from the decarbonization angle for at least the next 5-6 years. So that basically covers methanol. To figure out what goes on in ammonia, earlier I talked about 2030, you've got that $400 to $550 pricing window that needs to be broken. That's reflected in the 2030 blue bar over there. To see what ammonia price needs to be to penetrate it, I've taken ammonia price in Europe, and that green bar needs to intersect the blue bar for ammonia to actually take over as an economically viable fuel. And we can only see that happening onwards from 2040. So from 2040 to 2049, if you're running intra-EU, it may be viable for you to switch to e-ammonia from a commercial perspective. And from 2050, when obviously the few EU maritime penalties become more severe, suddenly the entire blue bar is above the green line, and then even if you're intra-EU, you're doing a container trade Far East to Europe, it might make more sense to entirely switch to ammonia. So we've done LNG, we've done methanol, we've done ammonia. I'm going to piece together the entire puzzle. This slide used to kind of confuse me, but now with this economics, hopefully I'll help you understand it a bit more. So in the legend from the bottom left, you see HSFO all the way to ammonia. If you flip it, it's the bottom to up for the charts. So let's start with something we know really well, which is 2023, 2024. As you can see, majority of the fuels are still HSFO, VLSFO, MGO. I want you to focus on LNG, which is the medium shade of blue. So as you can see, and as per my presentation, it's starting to become more economical. So we expect LNG to really penetrate the markets for the next 15, 16 years until 2040, where it will probably stagnate when the adoption of other green fuels come in. Next, I want to talk about methanol and ammonia. So that's on the right-hand side of the legend, which is the top two pieces. So methanol and ammonia, whilst we already see in the order book, it will only start gaining greater prominence from 2030 onwards. Methanol more so than ammonia just because it's technologically a bit more ready and a bit more available. So from my first slide, points 3 and 4, availability does matter. I haven't forgotten about biofuels, which is reflected in the light blue. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time today to cover on biofuels. So with that, I would just like to leave 3 key takeaways from you. Just a side note, the key takeaway is not SCB says dual fuel LNG is great, let's stop ordering ammonia and methanol. The key takeaway I want you to have is that people always come to me and say, CC, is it ammonia, is it methanol? And the answer is, it's everything. Shipping needs the entire chain of alternative fuels to reach its net zero targets, evident in the previous graph above. The other point is that, and point number 2, this is basically the caveats that I'm going to throw in. I've obviously used a lot of assumptions. For example, in the calculations above, I use a EUA pricing of 70 euros. If that is doubled, the entire economics will change. Next week, if MEPC 82 announces a $50 per ton carbon tax, again, the entire economics will change. So what I want to point out here is that fuel pricing will be extremely volatile. And when I first started in the shipping industry for an oil tanker company, and I was told, we want to buy a new built Suezmax, what is the fuel price for the next 5 years? I just took the crude oil price, I took the price of fuel oil, I looked at the crude futures, and I knew exactly what the price of shipping of fuels will be for the next 5 years. Now is an entirely different story. The price of biofuel is going to be driven by how much fried chicken oil is left over in the hawker stall that is eventually put into the entire supply chain. And every single alternative fuel will have its own unique supply and demand fundamentals. So there's going to be huge amounts of volatility. In addition, the industry has chosen to move towards well-to-wake calculations. For tank-to-wake, it's very simple. I turn on my engine, I know exactly how much emissions come out. Now with well-to-wake, I turn on my engine, I need to figure out where the fuel eventually came from before it ended up in the petrol station. With supply chains moving so dynamically, that constantly changing well-to-wake number and the benefits associated with each alternative marine fuel will constantly change. So amidst all these caveats, that leads me to my final point. Despite all the volatility that we expect in the market, we are in the business of risk. We are in the business of hedging. We've had several marine money panels in the past with SEB people talking about EU ETS and carbon hedging strategies. We actually have a few clients in the room who have used us this year for EU ETS hedging. So I would encourage you, we know how to manage your risk. Come and have a chat with us. More importantly, we are a global team with local reach. And you've heard from Karan Kinchi yesterday from our transition finance team. As you can tell, I've actually come from the industry and I work directly with the deal team. And later on, you will hear from my sustainable finance colleague, Mona. So we really have the whole piece from end to end with industry experience. We get global logistics, low carbon fuel infrastructure. And I guess that's the end of my presentation. And right after this, we've got Jack Pringle from Lloyd's, who's given me another caveat. So earlier for ammonia, I talked about how we will only see adoption from 2040 onwards. But he's very kindly pointed out that in the US, there's currently a subsidy scheme for blue ammonia. So again, my presentation doesn't take into account potential local subsidies and penalties, local carrots and sticks that could completely change the needle. So hopefully this gives you a flavor of what to expect for the alternative marine fuel sectors. And thank you for your time.